Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Tonight we have a review, and it is a discontinued gem review. Now, if you've been following my channel, and you know that I have playlists for every single house that I do a review on. So it's very easy for me to go back and see how many reviews I've done for each house. Well, with Tom Ford, I've only reviewed 4 fragrances, individual reviews so far. Only one of those 4 was one of the big mainstream releases, let's say, and that was Oud Wood. I did a Oud Wood ramble, basically. I don't even know if I would call that a review, but I rambled for a little bit about Oud Wood. The other 3 reviews, though, were focused on discontinued Tom Ford private blends. We have Sahara Noir is not a private blend, but it is discontinued, and I would love a bottle of Sahara Noir. And the other 2, Italian Cypress and Vert d'Encens, were discontinued private blends. And now we're doing a 3rd discontinued private blend. So you can see I'm not focusing on the mainstream releases. It would be very easy for me to put up a review of Tuscan Leather and probably get thousands of views. But I'm trying to focus on the ones that are a little off the beaten path. And this fragrance is probably the Tom Ford that if you put a gun to my head and said, Ramsey, pick a Tom Ford right now without even thinking, okay? If I got a full bottle or a flacon of a one long discontinued Tom Ford fragrance that I know, now I haven't smelled everything. There's a lot from the original releases, 2007 to 2008, 9, I have not smelled. Okay, but this is the one that I know because I very generously got a decant. And I'll tell you what, each mil of this goes for about $20, so you can imagine just how much every single spray is. And I've been giving this a fair amount of wear over the last 5 years or so. This is called Moss Breches, and God, I wish I had a bottle of this stuff, I'll tell you that. I did a spray about 20 or 30 minutes ago. Look at the sheen on my hand. It's probably like 20 bucks of juice right there. Oh, it is phenomenal. So, like I said, I would not even need half a second to go Moss Breches. Give me Tom Ford Moss Breches. It is probably one of the finest fragrances for my personal taste, okay? My personal taste from the Tom Ford private blend line that I do not own a full bottle of, okay? Now, like I said, I haven't smelled everything, but from what I've smelled, this would be my choice. And I've been doing a lot of positive reviews lately, and I think it would be easy for me to get on here and bash some of the fragrances that I've got some samples of, and that can come anytime. Sometimes it's almost like a little bit of a stress reliever to get on here and shit all over Versace Eros or, one of those type of fragrances, and I could do that anytime. But I've been trying to share some of the fragrances I really love with FragCom because, there's a lot of folks that do look to my nose. And now, one thing I will say, be very careful because hunting this down, this is a true unicorn. Even I have not been able to find a bottle yet. And so this is kind of one of those where if you're lucky enough to smell it, that may have to be good enough for you. But I think I've seen bottles sell for $1 to $2 grand. $1 to $2 grand for 50 mils. Okay, so keep that in mind. Prices are absolutely outrageous. But so for me, there's a couple of things that this fragrance has done for me over the last 5 years that's very important. And this is kind of a perfect example, I would say, of why I want to smell as much as I can in the fragrance game. You can go about your fragrance journey different. Everyone is different when it comes to collecting. Some people find a couple fragrances they love and they buy 10 bottles of each, and so their fragrance collection is not very, wide, but it's deep with the fragrances that they absolutely love. Others go about it where they just want to own one of everything and make their collection kind of like a little bit of a museum. When I first got my nose on this, I will tell you that because of some of my history with the vintage and discontinued fragrances, as soon as I smelled this, I went, Luciano Pavarotti. The very first thing that popped in my head was this. This is one of my bottles of Luciano Pavarotti that I absolutely love this stuff. It is one of my favorite honeyed patchouli type fragrances, okay? Now, if you don't know Luciano Pavarotti, which I also think is one of the greatest celebrity fragrances of all time, and I have a celebrity fragrance video on the channel if you'd like to check it out. But if you've never smelled Luciano Pavarotti, it means nothing to you. But when I smelled Moss Breches for the first time, I went niche Pavarotti. And Rich Mitch could probably back me up on this because I probably sent him a message. I think I remember sending him a message going, dude, have you ever smelled this, by the way? For a Pavarotti lover, this would be right up your alley. So for me in my fragrance journey, it's almost like I can draw a direct line between Givenchy Gentleman from 1974 to Giorgio Beverly Hills for Men from the mid 80s to Luciano Pavarotti to 1994 to Moss Breches in 2007. Like, if there is a honeyed patchouli line, a connection, which I think I may have even done a fragrance connection video and connected these four fragrances. If you go, I think I've done 3 fragrance connection videos, and this may have been kind of in one pod, if you will, this honeyed patchouli pod. So it has something to do with the way the honey and patchouli come together and the way that other notes are used, the oak moss, which of course is in the name Moss Breches. But what I basically tried to do is, I think what they tried to do when they made Moss Breches is they tried to make it almost like a modern, sort of revolutionary example of this honeyed patchouli. That's just my 2 cents on it. Okay, so even though it's called Moss Breches, the honeyed patchouli aspect is the one where I go back through history on. Oak moss is obviously a very important fixative. It's what kind of keeps it tied to your skin like glue. But I think when they were making this that they said, okay, let's take this honeyed patchouli, and if you know anything about Givenchy Gentleman, especially in the vintage sort of silver wraparound version, you know that this is an absolute beast. This is my favorite patchouli fragrance of all time, but it's also probably one of my favorite honey fragrances of all time. So it kind of covers many different bases here. But when they were building Moss Breches, if I was going to kind of reverse engineer it, I would say that they took that and said, okay, let's try and take this honeyed patchouli that has been so popular through the decades. Obviously, I listed one from the 70s, I listed one from the 80s, I listed one from the 90s. So this is a clearly classical composition that never goes out of style, right? And they said, what if we tried to make it aromatic, right? Fragrantica, for those of you who care, I think Fragrantica is wrong just as much as they're right, but they have aromatic listed as the #1 kind of note, ingredient or type of fragrance compound, if you will. So they have this aromatic sort of smell as #1. And what they tried to do is they use these very extremely aromatic and herbal and green notes. Now, it's not as green as you would expect with the name Moss Breches, but it is slightly green. You're going to get examples like Corsican rosemary, for example, very specific. Hungarian tarragon, again, very specific. Moroccan clary sage, very specific. And, of course, moss. And moss is in the name, and it does get mossier as it dries down. It lasts all day on me, I will tell you that. The moss sort of acts as this beautiful fixative, especially late into the dry down, and it literally fixes the fragrance to your skin like glue. So, now, even though I mentioned 3 famous fragrances from the past, there is a 4th that constantly gets brought up when it comes to Moss Breches. Constantly, okay? So this fragrance review is going to be a little bit like a trip down memory lane, if you will. But the 4th fragrance, and some people compare this most closely to Moss Breches, is this. And again, if you know, you know. This is Pierre Cardin's Pour Monsieur, which I have a Vintage Hall of Fame review on the channel if you would like to check this out. Pour Monsieur is from 1972, so this is the oldest fragrance that we're discussing in relation to Moss Breches, okay? And I think the reason that Pour Monsieur constantly gets brought up is that there is this, obviously it does have the honeyed patchouli, and I could probably even make the case that this is what influenced my favorite honey patchouli in 1974. What came out in 72 influenced this, but I could also make the case that this is what influenced an entire category of fragrance, amber fougères, which were most popular between the 80s and, let's say, 1990s. Early 90s, and I've got an entire amber fougere. This is not a top 10 if you really want to dive into that, okay? But I think the reason that Pierre Cardin's Pour Monsieur gets brought up is there are these leathery facets to Pour Monsieur, and it's also slightly powdery. There are some leathery aspects in Moss Breches, and it's also slightly powdery, okay? Not as powdery as Pour Monsieur. Pour Monsieur takes the cake as far as powderiness goes, let's say. But depending on the weather, and this fragrance is very weather sensitive, I must say. This is a very fickle fragrance. If I wear it in the heat, I wore it on the 4th of July today. If you hear fireworks outside, that's exactly what that is. Folks celebrating the 4th of July. But I wanted to wear something special on the 4th, and this is a fragrance I also have been wanting to review on the channel for a long time, so this makes it easy on me. But so the leather note for me comes out much heavier on warmer days. And I think depending on the weather, you're going to pick up different facets in this fragrance. So on warmer days, the leather pops almost instantly from the first spray. On cooler days, you have to wait a little bit, I think, for the leather note to really make an appearance. And interestingly, though, Luciano Pavarotti from 1994 works very similar on my skin. There's a Russian leather note in here which pops much heavier when I wear this in the heat. And when I don't wear it in the heat, sometimes you really have to kind of work to find that leather accord, whereas the patchouli and the honey are pretty evident from the get-go. And so as I said, if you watched my Vintage Hall of Fame review on Pierre Cardin's Pour Monsieur, one of the reasons why I gave it a Vintage Hall of Fame review is not because it's one of my favorite masculine fragrances of all time. Even though it's very good, I wouldn't consider it one of my all-time favorites. But the reason I did that is because I would consider this almost like a capstone fragrance. This is a fragrance in the masculine realm that just influenced so many different things. As I mentioned, the Amber Fougere category, things like Zeno or Heritage or Ungaro pour l'Homme 1, the original, would never be possible without this. I think they took a big sort of page from this book. Eigner's Free Life, all that good stuff came from this. And also, I really think that it influenced the honey patchouli category, okay? So making connections to the past and then talking about them in relation to Moss Breches, I have to say that I think the perfume nerd in me really likes that about this fragrance. Any fragrance that starts kind of getting the nodes in my brain connecting to different fragrances from the past is interesting to me. I appreciate a fragrance that makes a nod, an homage to the great perfumery of the past, okay? It's like honoring the great kings of the past, or emperors, or rulers, or pharaohs, whatever you prefer. But the perfume nerd in me digs it, I must admit. Making fragrance connections in history and time is a very interesting part of wearing Moss Breches. And I think that's kind of the brilliance of the fragrance hobby as well, at least to my nose. And these are my connections according to my nose. Now, it may be something you totally and 100% disagree with, but for me, it's as real as real can be. You know, when I smell this, I can see like there's literally like a string tied to these fragrances we discussed. So the second point that really hammers home the fragrance nerd part of wearing Moss Breches is that, and I can't kind of help but dwell on this, just thinking intellectually about fragrance wearing. First time I wore this, and how your nose changes over time. First time I wore this, I was sure, like 100% sure, like you could have put a gun to my head and said, Ramsey, tell me one truth right now, and I easily would have said, this is a clone of Pavarotti. Like, no doubt about it. It is Pavarotti through and through. And obviously in the last 4 or 5 years, I've smelled hundreds, thousands probably of fragrances. And smelling it today, my opinion has changed, let's just say. Maybe I'm a little bit wiser. Maybe my nose has become more mature. I have no idea. But whatever it is, I do see the similarity to Pavarotti, but I think it goes about it in a little bit of a different path. It attacks it a little bit different. Okay, its plan of attack is a little bit different. It's almost like kind of a similar problem that I think a writer has. You know, one of the things about writing is when you write something down. Let's say you release a book, right? You're a writer. That book is forever. You released your thoughts on paper. Somebody can come back years, decades. You know, if you released it when you're 20, they can come back when you're an 80-year-old man and hound you about what you said in that book, right? I think making YouTube videos is very similar to that, because you put your thoughts out there, you put your ideas out there, and if 4 or 5 years later your thoughts change, well, people may still be watching your video from 4 or 5 years ago, right? So for me, if I would have done this video 5 years ago, I would have said that this took 90% of what it came from Pavarotti. And like I said, today my opinion has changed. There is something very similar though, because interestingly enough, there are also green and aromatic touches in Pavarotti. So you noticed I mentioned the Russian leather note, and there's a leathery touch in here. Um, there's also this green aromatic touch in Pavarotti, but they go about it differently, is what I think makes them different. In Pavarotti, they use this note of ivy, which is rare. You don't see it used very often. There's an ivy note in Beach Hut Man, which I'm going to review from Amouage very soon. But both could technically, I guess, be considered leather chypres. I mean, technically, they could be considered that. But I think Pavarotti wears a little bit darker than Moss Breches. Moss Breches, as the years have ticked by, and as I've occasionally carefully either worn this as my scent of the day on special occasions like July 4th, or I've just sprayed it on before bed because I want to preserve the very little amount of juice that I have left. I think that Moss Breches, I've noticed a couple things. Number one, the heavier use of benzoin and vanilla. Now, I must admit, even though I would consider that it's one note that, blended to my nose, it feels like the vanilla and the benzoin just kind of come together in Moss Breches. Like they just merge together to form this vanilla benzoin note that you smell, okay? That combo of vanilla and benzoin is done, though, how I like it. It's not super sweet. Interestingly enough, the honey note in here is not super sweet as well. There is a sweetness to it, but it's almost like it allows the ingredient to come to you naturally, okay? You don't get this disgusting synthetic sweetness like when I reviewed Giseda's Titanium. If you want to laugh, just go watch that review. Nothing like that at all. The sweetness in here is done kind of in the vintage style, if you will, okay? And if you ask me to, but one thing that I think is very important to point out before I move on is that the way that they use the vanilla and the benzoin, even though those are heavier notes, patchouli and honey are heavier notes, nothing overshadows the more aromatic notes in Moss Breches. So, for example, that would be things like the clary sage, the rosemary. There is also a note of Hungarian tarragon, which we'll get to here in a little bit, but nothing overshadows it. It's like they took the core of that honey patchouli from the past, okay? From these past fragrances, these fragrance greats, but they wanted to make like a more aromatic version. You still get the vanilla, you still get the benzoin. It's there. It's brilliantly done, actually, but nothing is allowed to overshadow that aromatic element. They wanted it to feel, it's nowhere near as heavy as the note tree makes it sound, if that makes sense. It lasts forever on my skin, but it doesn't wearing it in the heat is no problem for me, if that makes sense. And so the combination of honey and patchouli and Moss Breches, and actually the honey note used here, technically, according to Parfumo, is a beeswax absolute and a honeycomb note. So there's actually two honey notes in here, honeycomb and beeswax absolute, okay? And so that combination gives it a little bit of a funk, like a little bit of a dirty, traditional honey funkiness, okay? It's a little funky, it's a little dirty, but just like the vanilla benzoin combination, it doesn't overshadow the whole point. The thesis of the fragrance is allowed to shine through, okay? So it's almost as if like the main bits of the plot here that Stephen Nilsen, who's the perfumer, by the way, not always do Tom Ford disclose the perfumer, but here it's Stephen Nilsen, which, by the way, this is 110% the best thing he's ever done, in my opinion. I don't think he's done anything close to this, but kind of wanted to highlight the aromatic part and make sure nothing around it overshadowed the main plot, and they did that through and through. It almost felt like that was a major bullet point in a focus of them, and they completed that task. So to me, the fragrance is like a perfect incarnation of a Tom Ford private blend. Top shelf ingredients, blast from the past, brought to modern times. And the other thing I should mention is there's a little bit of this spice blend especially when you first spray. God knows what type of spice it is, but sometimes, depending on the weather, again, the fragrance can be very fickle. It hits me pretty heavy, and I think, you have to focus on the spice notes, and then other times when I'm wearing it, it's almost like the spice comes across very subdued, like it's a major secondary player. There's really no spice notes listed in the note listing, which I don't think I actually read to you guys, but beeswax absolute, Corsican rosemary, honeycomb, Hungarian tarragon, Moroccan clary sage, Tuscan bergamot, which you do get a little hint of bergamot, but then it very quickly is overtaken by the spices, and that honeyed patchouli combination, moss and patchouli. That's it. That's the only note listing that I would trust reading to you guys. So the spice blend is not listed as a note listing. They didn't make it important enough as a note listing, but sometimes, depending on the weather, you will get this spiciness that tends to come through, okay? Other times, it's very subdued. Now, as the fragrance dries and you get kind of deep into the dry down, the smoothness of the honey, and that's something that I really have to point out. The way the honey and the patchouli seem to create this smooth sort of layer, or like this sheet on top of the rest of the fragrance, kind of is a major part of the way that the fragrance wears. Because that smoothness is just, even though it's slightly dirty, slightly funky, it's got that vintage, old school, dirty, animalic, honey-like feel in some of my favorite honey fragrances. Think of it's not as dirty as Boss Number 1, but it kind of gives you little hints of the way honey used to be used back in the day. And that's one of the reasons I love it, okay? But it almost creates this like sheet, this layer on top of the fragrance. But that starts to fade away as the hours go by. And the patchouli is one of the heavier notes that lasts into the dry down, the earthy patchouli and the moss. And it just kind of seems to melt into this woody, mossy base that has this amazing amount of noise and texture, is how I would describe it. So imagine you're like sitting next to a white noise machine, right? And the white noise machine is just offering something that isn't silence, right? That is how I think the base of this fragrance feels. It's like a great example of why moss in perfume, oak moss, mosses, tree moss, whatever it may be, such an important part of a perfumer's palette. Because when you first spray this fragrance, it's interesting because obviously the name is Moss Breches, and moss hits you almost from the very beginning, I think. Almost like right there in the top couple seconds, you get this big hit of like smoky oak moss, smoke moss from back in the day. Almost like vintage in stature, in style, right out of the gate. And then seconds later it recedes. And it sort of lets the patchouli honey combination start to kind of meld together and do its thing. And that smoothness, the little bit of the spices come in, a little bit of the vanilla and the benzoin, which also merge together. So, you know, it's like the patchouli and the honey merge together, the benzoin and the vanilla merge together. And it sort of steps back. The moss makes the intro and then steps back and allows the rest of the fragrance to have all the fun. It allows the aromatic notes to kind of take over and have their part of the party. But then later on, the oak moss sort of comes back and finishes everything out. So these aromatic notes that I keep mentioning importantly includes tarragon, which is one of my all-time favorite notes. If I see tarragon in a perfume, 99.9% of the time I love it. It's one of like a secret Ramsey hack, like tarragon's in it. I love it. And tarragon kind of gives, in Moss Breches, you'll get, oh, it's beautiful. So you'll get like this sort of slight inkling of licorice, like black licorice smell, okay? But just the tiniest inkling. Not so much where, it's not like, it's not like Lolita Lempicka or the Flanker, which is even more black licorice, which I'll review one of these days, these two. It's not like this is like the ultimate black licorice fragrance for me. It's not like these two where the licorice is really, really prominent, but the anise or the tarragon just gives this slight sort of anise-like smell that gives little inklings, okay, little clues of licorice, if you will, and hints of that bitter anise in the background. And so when the fragrance is really highlighting the aromatic portion of the scent, along with this very oily rosemary that just screams vintage masculine perfumery. So you can see where they're thinking, right? The rosemary throws you back to things like Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, for example. Brilliant rosemary in here. And so you get this sort of oily rosemary, screams vintage masculine perfumery, and of course the honey patchouli combination, as I said, screams vintage masculine perfumery. And it's funny because Costco, which is one of my favorite stores, although I hate their policies, but I love shopping at Costco. They once sold like a whole like honeycomb, okay? So like the honey was inside and you were supposed to eat the whole thing. I don't know if anyone's ever eaten an entire like honeycomb before, but it's the only time I've ever done it. I only bought it one time. Probably wouldn't buy it again because it was like one of those novelty things, but it had almost like a dirty, waxy texture to it. Like it would like stick to the roof of your mouth and you'd have to like chew the shit out of the honeycomb. And it was supposed to be really good for you, apparently. I don't know. But imagine like this animalic, waxy honeycomb, like enveloping the entire scent. And that's kind of the way that the honey note feels, and it's executed here. Very, very vintage in style and execution. And I know that people like Frederick Malle have gone on record saying, hey, many of my fragrances are inspired by vintage perfumery. And if you know Tom Ford, he's gone on record saying his favorite fragrance is this little bad boy right here, which I will be giving a Vintage Hall of Fame review to one of these days. This is Halston Z-14. Sadly discontinued. And actually one of the reviews of Tom Ford on my channel is Italian Cypress, and that's an homage to Z-14. So you can check that out if you want to hear a little bit about Tom Ford's take on Z-14. But it's obviously an homage to the brilliance of Z-14. But it's good to wear this type of perfumery for me and make these obvious connections to the past, I think. It's almost like you're actually sitting in the boardroom with Tom Ford and the perfumer. You're sitting there in your $5,000 suit, and you're in on the ground floor making the decisions because you kind of know the past and what's inspired something like Moss Breches. So I think for the average frag head, this would be, I don't think they would understand why somebody would pay $1,000 for it, okay? Would I pay $1,000 for this? No, absolutely not. If I found a bottle for $300 or $400 and $500, would I? Maybe. I would have to really think long and hard about it because this is one of those collection pieces that not only is awesome for the collection, I love rare fragrances like this because, like I said many times, there's a collector's side to this hobby as well. It's not just the fragrance itself. If it's just the fragrance itself, I could stop buying fragrances now for the rest of my life because I would be set. There's no way I could use all this unless I just sprayed, right? Which I may do one day. You never know. But the fragrance itself just fits my personality. Like this is the type of fragrance that I would love to be able to spray and not have to worry about, oh, that's all the juice I have left. But yes, I would say knowing where the fragrance was inspired by, being taken through that past journey, and then being brought forward into this modern, almost like niche execution. Very, very interesting stuff. So hats off to Tom Ford. One of my favorite private blends. I'm glad I can kind of shine a little spotlight on it. I'm sorry most people are going to go, man, I'd love to try this, but it's impossible to find. And unfortunately, that's the reality of the situation. But I like doing these type of off the beaten path reviews. So I hope you guys learned something about maybe a private blend you knew nothing about, Moss Breches. If anyone's familiar with it, do let me know. As always, love seeing your faces in the comments. Thank you to everyone who got us to 9,000 subscribers. There will be some list videos coming up in the next couple days. So appreciate everyone watching, commenting, liking, subscribing. So cheers, guys. See you in the comments. Take care. Bye-bye. Happy 4th.